The clock had just struck 9:30 p.m. as Eric and I walked down the fog-filled streets, our jackets zipped tight against the night's chill. The city was unusually quiet, the mist swallowing sound and muting the neon lights that flickered above closed storefronts. I stuffed my hands deeper into my pockets, the anticipation building inside me. It was Eric's idea to come out here, to find the infamous diner that only opened at night. I wasn't convinced it was a good idea, but curiosity gnawed at me. "What's the deal with this place again?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the fog, or the unsettling silence around us. Eric shot me a grin, his breath visible in the cold air. "Rumor has it the diner opens at exactly 10 p.m. and closes before dawn. Some people say it's older than the city itself." He paused for effect. "And of course, the rules. The rules. That's what everyone talked about. Online forums, late-night campus discussions, and even random whispers at parties. The 10 p.m. diner's rules were legendary, each more bizarre than the last. Yet despite all the speculation, no one seemed to know why they existed or who enforced them. Some said it was just a quirky tradition to attract business. Others hinted at something darker, a power that the diner held over its patrons. "You think it's just a gimmick?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Probably," Eric replied. "But isn't that part of the fun? Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" I forced a smile, more to convince myself than him. The idea of the rules didn't sit right with me. But then again, how weird could a diner really be? We turned a corner and the building came into view. It sat at the end of a darkened alleyway, wedged between two ancient brick structures. "There it is," Eric said, nodding toward the dim glow ahead. The diner's facade was cracked and faded, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside. The only sign of life was a flickering neon sign above the entrance, casting a sickly yellow light onto the wet pavement. As we approached, I noticed a faint outline of people through the grime-streaked glass. My stomach tightened. "You ready?" Eric asked, grabbing the door handle. I hesitated for a split second, glancing at the street behind us. The fog seemed thicker now, swallowing everything in its path. It felt like the world was closing in on us. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, let's do this." Eric pulled the door open and we stepped inside. A wave of warm, stale air hit me, carrying with it the scent of old leather, coffee, and a faint hint of something metallic. The interior was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. I scanned the room, trying to get my bearings. Booths lined the walls, their red leather cushions cracked and worn with age. A long counter stretched out on the opposite side, stools with torn fabric tops lined up neatly. There were a few customers scattered around. A man sitting by himself, staring at the window. An elderly couple whispering over their cups. And a lone woman with her back to us, spooning sugar into her drink in a slow, methodical manner. But what struck me the most was how still everything seemed. The other patrons barely moved, their actions sluggish, like they were part of some strange, slow-motion dream. I glanced at Eric, who appeared to have noticed it too. His usual bravado seemed to wane slightly as we walked toward an empty booth in the center of the room. The seats squeaked under our weight as we sat down. Eric, always one for theatrics, leaned forward and whispered, "Okay, this place is officially creepy." "Yeah, no kidding," I replied, my eyes scanning the room again. Something about the diner made my skin crawl, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was as if the place itself was watching us. Our conversation was interrupted by the silent arrival of a waitress. She appeared seemingly out of nowhere, placing 2 menus on the table without so much as a word. Her movements were smooth, almost robotic, and she left as quickly as she had come. Eric raised an eyebrow at me, clearly unnerved. "Well, that was something," he muttered. "Guess we're not getting the warm and friendly service tonight." I picked up the menu, my curiosity piqued. It felt old, the plastic cover worn and sticky to the touch. Then I noticed the writing on the front, bold, black letters spelling out "House Rules." Beneath the title was a list of numbered instructions, each one stranger than the last. Rule 1. Never sit facing the entrance unless you are the first customer to arrive. Rule 2. Never greet the staff when they approach. Only speak when spoken to. Rule 3. If a stranger joins your table uninvited, offer them a sip of your drink, then excuse yourself to the restroom. Return only when the diner clock chimes. Rule 4. If you hear soft humming while eating, immediately close your eyes and wait for the humming to stop. Rule 5. If a waiter drops something, you must turn away and not look at them until they leave your table. Rule 6. If you hear your name whispered from behind, do not turn around. Pretend you did not hear it. Rule 7. Should your utensil fall, leave it there. Do not bend down to pick it up, or you risk seeing something under the table that shouldn't be there. Rule 8. If you hear footsteps following you as you leave, do not turn around. Slow your pace until the sound fades away. I read through the list twice, each rule more unsettling than the one before. My mouth went dry as I realized how specific they were. These weren't rules for a quaint diner experience. They were warnings. My eyes darted back to Rule 1. Never sit facing the entrance unless you are the first customer to arrive. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced over my shoulder at the glass door. "Look at this," Eric whispered, pointing at Rule 4. "If you hear soft humming while eating, close your eyes. What is this place? A haunted house?" I forced a laugh, but my heart wasn't in it. "It's probably just some elaborate gimmick," I said, trying to convince myself. "You know, to get people talking." "Yeah, right," Eric replied, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Well, we came here for the experience. Let's just roll with it." He looked at me, waiting for some kind of agreement. I nodded, feeling a tight knot of anxiety form in my chest. We flipped open the menus and pretended to browse the food options, though neither of us really had an appetite. My eyes kept drifting back to the rules, especially Rule 1. Wait, we weren't the first ones here. I trailed off, glancing at the door. Through the grimy glass, something moved. I couldn't make it out clearly, just a dark silhouette shifting in and out of the foggy night. It was tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to sway as it stood there. I blinked, trying to focus, but it faded into the darkness. "What?" Eric asked, leaning forward. "What did you see?" "There's something out there," I muttered, not taking my eyes off the door. I don't know what it was, but it looked... "Don't mess with me," he interrupted, his voice strained. "This place is already creepy enough." "I'm not messing with you," I snapped, turning back to face him. "I swear I saw something." We both went silent, the unease between us growing thicker. The rules weren't a joke. I was sure of it now. This place had its own set of laws, its own way of operating, and we were already violating one. We sat there in silence, waiting. The waitress reappeared, sliding up to our table without a sound, her hollow eyes staring straight through us. My skin crawled at the sight of her. Remembering Rule 2, I bit my tongue and stared at the menu in front of me, resisting the urge to greet her or even acknowledge her presence. Eric's eyes widened as if he had to force himself to stay quiet. After a long, unsettling pause, the waitress finally spoke, her voice monotone and distant. "What would you like to order?" She didn't ask it like a question, more like a command. The words felt cold and wrong, echoing strangely in the air around us. It was as if the sound didn't belong in this place. Eric coughed and glanced at me, seeking some form of validation. I nodded subtly, indicating he should answer first. He took a deep breath and said, "I'll have a black coffee and pancakes." His voice trembled slightly, but he managed to get the words out. The waitress turned her gaze to me, her eyes boring into mine like a predator assessing its prey. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her eyes for only a moment before I replied, "Same for me, please." She didn't react, didn't even blink. She just scribbled something onto her notepad and turned to leave. As she walked away, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though a great weight had lifted off my chest. I exhaled slowly, my heartbeat gradually returning to a more regular rhythm. "That was weird," Eric muttered, breaking the silence between us. "Did you see how she looked at us?" I nodded, rubbing my hands together to warm them. "Yeah, like she was judging us for even being here," I replied, keeping my voice low. And the way she spoke, it was like she didn't care what we ordered, almost like it didn't matter. We sat in silence for a few minutes, staring at each other, too afraid to voice the questions racing through our minds. We both knew something wasn't right. This place felt wrong, like it was bending reality in subtle ways, making us question our perceptions. After what felt like an eternity, the waitress returned with our orders. She placed the coffee cups and plates in front of us with meticulous precision, her movements almost robotic. "Enjoy your meal," she intoned, before turning on her heel and drifting back to the shadows. "Did you hear that?" Eric asked, leaning closer to me. She said, "Enjoy your meal." It's like she was forcing herself to say it. I nodded, my eyes locked on the steaming cup of coffee in front of me. I had an overwhelming urge to down the coffee and leave, to get as far away from this diner as possible. But something inside me, perhaps morbid curiosity, kept me rooted in my seat. I picked up my fork and prodded at the pancakes, watching the syrup ooze slowly down the sides. Then it started. A soft, melodic humming filled the air around us. My heart skipped a beat as I remembered Rule 4. If you hear soft humming while eating, immediately close your eyes and wait for the humming to stop. "Eric," I hissed, grabbing his wrist. His eyes widened in alarm as he too began to hear the sound. "Close your eyes, now." "What?" he stammered, his fork frozen in midair. "Just do it," I snapped, shutting my own eyes tightly. I heard Eric mutter a curse before he followed suit. The humming grew louder, swelling into a haunting lullaby that reverberated through my skull. It was everywhere, in the air, in my ears, inside my own head. My grip on the fork tightened until my knuckles turned white. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, trying to focus on anything but the unnerving sound. I felt a cold presence sweep through the room, like a gust of wind in an enclosed space. My skin prickled, and the air grew thick and suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to open my eyes, to look at what was happening around us. But I knew that would break the rule. I had to stay still. I had to endure. The humming seemed to circle our table, changing in pitch and rhythm as if it was studying us, trying to coax us into making a mistake. My breathing grew ragged, my chest tightening with fear. I wanted to reach out to Eric, to feel some form of connection, but I was too afraid to move. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the humming ceased. I held my breath, waiting, listening. I heard Eric's shaky breathing beside me, but no other sound disturbed the air. "It's over," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think we can open our eyes now." I hesitated, then slowly cracked my eyes open. The diner was exactly as it had been before, but it felt different, colder, darker. I glanced at Eric, who looked as pale as a ghost. His eyes were wide, darting around the room in a panic. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It was like something was right here." "Yeah," I replied, my mouth dry. I glanced at the other patrons, expecting to see them staring at us, judging us for our fear. But they all sat motionless, eating their meals as if nothing had happened. I glanced down at my plate, my appetite completely gone. The pancakes looked wrong somehow, grayer, like the color had drained from them. I pushed the plate away, my stomach churning. "Let's get out of here," Eric muttered, his eyes darting nervously to the entrance. "I don't care about the rules anymore. I want to leave." I opened my mouth to agree when the waitress returned, appearing silently at the edge of our table. My heart nearly stopped. Rule 2, I reminded myself. Don't speak unless spoken to. I clamped my mouth shut and waited, my heart pounding in my ears. "Would you like anything else?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion. I shook my head, avoiding her gaze. She lingered for a moment, her presence sending a chill down my spine before turning away and gliding back to the counter. "Okay, that's it," Eric whispered harshly. "We're leaving. Now." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. As we prepared to stand up, I glanced at the menu again, my eyes catching the list of rules. Rule 8 loomed in my mind like a warning. If you hear footsteps following you as you leave, do not turn around. Slow your pace until the sound fades away. We weren't done yet. The worst was yet to come. Eric stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, cutting through the oppressive silence that hung in the diner. A sense of dread washed over me. There was a nagging feeling that we were far from done with this place. Eric reached for his wallet, tossing a few bills onto the table. "Let's just go," he muttered under his breath, his eyes wide and darting toward the entrance. He wanted out, and so did I. We started walking toward the door, the air around us seeming to thicken with every step. My legs felt heavy, as though I were wading through mud. The soft clinking of cutlery and hushed murmurs of the other patrons filled the space, but my senses were hyper-focused on our escape. Then, just as we were a few feet from the door, I heard it, the distinct scrape of a chair behind us. My heart dropped. Someone had joined our table. I glanced at Eric, whose face had gone ghostly white. "Oh no," he whispered, barely audible over the diner's eerie ambience. Rule 3. Slowly, I turned back to look. There, sitting in my seat, was a tall, lanky figure. The man wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in pictures from decades past. His head was bent forward, his hair hanging over his face like a dark curtain, obscuring his features. A wave of cold swept over me. The atmosphere around him felt wrong, as if he didn't belong in this world. "We have to follow the rule," I hissed at Eric, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's get back to the table." With reluctance, we approached the stranger. He remained utterly still, his head angled forward as if studying something invisible on the table. The room seemed to grow darker, colder, the air pressing down on my chest. My palms were slick with sweat, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I grabbed my cup of coffee, my hand trembling, and placed it in front of the stranger. "Here," I managed to say. "Have a sip." His hand moved in slow, deliberate motions as he reached for the cup. His fingers were unnaturally long and thin, with skin that seemed almost translucent. He lifted the cup to his lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip. A chill crawled up my spine, and I fought the urge to look away. "Restroom," I croaked, nudging Eric. "We need to go." Eric nodded, his eyes locked on the stranger. We backed away from the table, careful not to break eye contact until we reached the restroom door. The moment we were inside, we both exhaled, as though we had just come up for air after being submerged in dark water. "What the hell was that?" Eric rasped, clutching the edge of the sink. "Who was that guy?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice shaky. "But we had to follow the rule. Now we wait until the clock chimes." Seconds felt like minutes as we stood there, listening to our own ragged breaths echoing in the tiny room. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The air was stifling, pressing down on us as if the diner itself was alive, watching our every move. Then the cafe clock outside began to chime. 1, 2, 3 chimes. We exchanged a glance, swallowing the lump of fear lodged in our throats. It was time to return. As we stepped out of the restroom, we dared to approach the table. It was empty. The stranger was gone, leaving only our 2 cups and the uneaten plates of pancakes behind. I exhaled shakily, but my relief was short-lived. As we turned back toward the entrance, something metallic clattered against the floor. I froze. My fork had fallen, clinking loudly as it hit the ground, spinning a few times before settling just under the table. I felt my heart leap into my throat. Rule 7. Should your utensil fall, leave it there. Do not bend down to pick it up, or you risk seeing something under the table that shouldn't be there. "Leave it," I whispered urgently to Eric, who was staring wide-eyed at the fork. "Don't look under the table." He nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear. I could feel the tension radiating off him, his body rigid and tense. We were both aware of what Rule 7 warned us about, and yet the urge to look was almost unbearable, like an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. Then we heard it, a soft, muffled sound coming from beneath the table. It was the faint, heart-wrenching sobs of a child, crying softly in the darkness beneath us. My stomach twisted violently, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. "Don't listen," I muttered through clenched teeth, my eyes fixed on a point far away. "It's not real. Just focus." The crying grew louder, more desperate, echoing in the small space of the diner. It was the kind of sound that clawed at your heart, demanding your attention. Tears welled up in my eyes, not from sadness, but from sheer terror. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the noise, but the cries persisted, coming in waves of anguish and despair, each one stronger than the last. Eric shifted uncomfortably beside me. It's just a trick," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "We can't look. We can't." The cries turned into words, garbled and barely recognizable but unmistakably pleading. "Please, help me." The voice tugged at the deepest recesses of my sympathy, igniting an instinct to look, to bend down and see who, or what, was under there. The crying continued, now mixed with small, shuffling sounds like tiny feet dragging across the floor. My skin crawled, every nerve screaming for me to glance down and see what was beneath the table. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, the line between what was real and what wasn't, blurring under the pressure of the noise. Then, a tiny hand wrapped around the leg of my chair. I stiffened, my muscles locking up in paralyzing fear. It gripped tightly, almost urgently, as though begging me to help. My heart raced so fast I thought it might burst. "Don't look," I hissed to Eric, fighting the urge to jump up and run. "It's not real." The grip on my chair tightened, and the crying turned into a pitiful wail. My eyes burned from the effort of not looking down, of not acknowledging the nightmare unfolding beneath us. I could feel my sanity teetering on the edge, about to break. And then, as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. The hand released its grip, the crying faded into silence, and the air around us returned to its suffocating stillness. I dared to glance at Eric, who was pale and shaking, his eyes wide and haunted. "Did you see that?" he croaked. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, but we didn't look under the table. We followed the rule." He exhaled shakily, his hand still gripping the edge of the table. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, his voice strained. "I can't take this anymore." "Agreed," I replied, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. We stood up slowly, careful not to glance under the table as we backed away. I couldn't help but notice that the rest of the diner continued on as if nothing had happened. The patrons still eating, the waitress still standing behind the counter with her hollow stare. We started toward the exit, moving cautiously. As we reached the door, I heard it. A faint, distant whisper of footsteps following us. My body tensed, remembering Rule 8. If you hear footsteps following you as you leave, do not turn around. Slow your pace until the sound fades away. "Don't turn around," I warned Eric, my voice strained. "Just walk slowly." The door was just a few feet away. My hand reached out, grasping the cold handle, and I pushed it open. The footsteps stopped as we crossed the threshold into the foggy night. I turned to Eric, both of us breathing heavily, our faces pale and drawn. "Let's go," I muttered, my voice barely holding together, "and never come back." We hurried down the street, the diner's oppressive aura fading behind us. Neither of us spoke, too afraid of what we might say, of what might still be lingering in the air around us. As we rounded the corner, I chanced a final glance back. The diner stood silent, its dim neon sign flickering in the fog. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow at the window, staring out, watching us. I looked away and quickened my pace. Whatever had happened in there, I knew one thing for certain. We were never coming back.